The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 in the morning, just like it had every day for the past 15 years. Roberto rolled out of bed and rubbed his tired eyes. His small apartment was quiet, except for the sound of the old radiator clanking in the corner. He shuffled to the bathroom and looked at himself in the cracked mirror. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of another restless night. Roberto had the kind of job that most people never really thought about. He worked at Friendly Meats, a small butcher shop on the corner of Pine Street. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table for him and his 12-year-old daughter, Isabella. That was what mattered most. By 5:15, he was already at the shop, turning on the lights and getting everything ready for another day. The meat delivery truck would arrive soon, and Roberto needed to prepare the display cases. He put on his white apron, the same one he had worn for years. It was clean when he started each morning, but by the end of the day, it would tell the story of his work. The delivery truck rumbled up to the back door right on schedule. Tony, the driver, had been making this run for almost as long as Roberto had worked at the shop. They nodded to each other as they unloaded boxes of fresh meat and fish. Roberto's hands moved quickly and skillfully as he sorted everything. Beef here, pork there, chicken in the refrigerated section. The fish went into the special ice-filled display case near the front window. Roberto knew his job well. He could cut a perfect steak, prepare ground meat exactly how customers wanted it, and clean fish faster than anyone else in the neighborhood. His hands were strong from years of work, and he took pride in doing things right. But there was something else about Roberto that nobody at the shop knew. Something he kept hidden from the world. When Mrs. Chen came in for her usual order of chicken thighs, she was polite but distant. She always asked for exactly 2 pounds, sliced thin, and she always paid with exact change. Roberto wrapped her order carefully and handed it to her with a smile. She took it without looking directly at him and left quickly. This happened every Tuesday, and it was always the same. The morning rush brought a steady stream of customers. Some were regulars who had been coming to the shop for years. Others were new faces who had discovered the place recently. Roberto served them all with the same careful attention. He made sure every cut of meat was exactly what they asked for. He kept his workspace clean and organized. He was good at his job, even if people didn't always see it that way. Around 10 o'clock, a well-dressed woman walked into the shop. Roberto had never seen her before, but he could tell from her clothes and the way she carried herself that she probably lived in one of the expensive houses on the other side of town. She looked around the shop with the expression of someone who wasn't quite sure she was in the right place. "Excuse me," she said, not quite looking at Roberto directly. "I need some salmon fillets for a dinner party tonight. They need to be perfect." Roberto nodded and walked over to the fish display. He selected the best pieces, ones with bright color and firm texture. As he worked, he could feel the woman watching him carefully. She seemed nervous, like she was worried he might not do the job right. Roberto was used to this kind of reaction. He wrapped the salmon carefully and handed it to her. "That'll be $28, he said politely. The woman paid quickly and left without saying thank you. Roberto watched her through the window as she hurried to her expensive car. He wondered if the salmon would be good enough for her dinner party. He was confident it would be. He knew fish better than most people knew anything. The afternoon brought more of the same. Customers came and went. Some were friendly, others were not. Roberto treated them all the same way. He was professional and careful with every order. But he noticed things. The way some people held their breath when they talked to him. The way they stepped back slightly when he handed them their packages. The way they seemed in a hurry to leave. Roberto understood why this happened. Working with meat and fish all day meant that certain smells became part of you. No matter how much he washed his hands, no matter how many times he showered, there was always a faint smell that lingered. It was just part of the job. But that didn't make it easier when people reacted the way they did. At 3 o'clock, Isabella stopped by the shop on her way home from school. She was a bright, happy girl with her father's dark eyes and her mother's smile. Roberto's face always lit up when he saw her. She was the best part of his day every day. "Hi, Papa," she said, giving him a hug despite his work clothes. Isabella never seemed to mind the way he smelled. To her, he was just her dad. "How was school today, mija?" Roberto asked, using the Spanish word for daughter that his own mother had used with his sister. "It was okay," Isabella said. "We're having a talent show next month. All the kids are talking about what they're going to do. Roberto felt his heart skip a beat. He knew what Isabella was thinking, but he also knew it wasn't that simple. "What are you thinking about doing?" he asked carefully. Isabella looked around the shop to make sure no other customers were listening. Then she lowered her voice. "I want to play piano, Papa. You could teach me that piece you've been working on." "The pretty one." Roberto's throat felt tight. "Isabella, we've talked about this. It's complicated. But Papa, you play so beautifully. Better than anyone I've ever heard. Why don't you want other people to know?" Roberto looked at his daughter's hopeful face and felt his heart breaking a little. How could he explain that the world saw him only as the man who smelled like the butcher shop? How could he tell her that people had already decided who he was and what he was worth? How could he make her understand that sometimes keeping beautiful things private was the only way to protect them? "Maybe someday, mija," he said softly. "But not yet." Isabella nodded, but Roberto could see the disappointment in her eyes. She hugged him again and promised to be home by dinner. After she left, Roberto stood alone in the shop, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of his work. He looked at his hands, stained and rough from 15 years of cutting meat and cleaning fish. These same hands that customers avoided touching when he handed them their change. These same hands that made people step back and hold their breath. But Roberto knew something that none of those customers knew. He knew that when he got home that evening, after he had showered and changed clothes, these same hands would sit down at the old upright piano in his living room. These hands would play music that could make angels weep. These hands held beauty that the world couldn't see, because the world had already decided what they were worth. The shop would close at 6, just like always. Roberto would clean everything, turn off the lights, and lock the door. Then he would go home to his small apartment, to his daughter, and to his music. Tomorrow would be another day, just like this one. But for now, he had work to finish and bills to pay. That was just how things were. 3 weeks later, Roberto stood in front of his bathroom mirror, trying to scrub away the smell that seemed to live under his fingernails. Tonight was different. Tonight was Isabella's school fundraiser, and he had promised to be there. She had been talking about it for weeks, excited because all the parents would be there together for once. Roberto had bought a new shirt for the occasion. It was nothing fancy, just a plain blue button-down from the discount store, but it was clean and it fit well. He had showered twice and used extra soap. He brushed his teeth 3 times and used mouthwash. Still, he worried that people would smell the butcher shop on him. It was like the scent had become part of who he was. Isabella appeared in the doorway of the bathroom wearing her best dress. It was a simple yellow dress that her grandmother had sent for her birthday. She had brushed her long dark hair until it shone, and she was practically bouncing with excitement. "Papa, you look so handsome," she said, adjusting his collar with careful hands. "Are you nervous?" Roberto smiled at his daughter. "A little bit, mija. I don't know many of the other parents." "Don't worry, Papa. Everyone will love you just like I do." Roberto wished he could believe that. Isabella saw the world through different eyes. She saw the best in everyone, especially in him. But Roberto knew that other people weren't always so kind. Still, he didn't want to dim his daughter's excitement with his own worries. The school gym had been decorated with colorful streamers and balloons. Tables were set up around the edges of the room, each one covered with donated items for the silent auction. Parents stood in small groups talking and laughing. Roberto could see immediately that he was different from most of them. Their clothes were newer, their shoes were polished, and they all seemed to know each other already. Isabella grabbed his hand and pulled him toward a group of her classmates and their families. "Everyone, this is my papa," she announced proudly. "His name is Roberto." The other parents smiled politely and introduced themselves. There was Mr. Johnson, who worked at the bank downtown. Mrs. Patterson, who was a nurse at the hospital. Dr. Williams, who had his own practice in the medical building on Main Street. They all seemed nice enough, but Roberto could tell they were trying to figure out who he was and what he did for work. "So, Roberto," Dr. Williams said, "what line of work are you in?" Roberto felt his cheeks get warm. "I work at the butcher shop on Pine Street," he said quietly. There was a moment of awkward silence. Then Mrs. Patterson smiled brightly and changed the subject to the weather. Roberto noticed how the group slowly shifted away from him as the conversation continued. It was subtle, but he felt it. Isabella didn't seem to notice. She was busy showing her friends the bracelet her father had bought her for good luck. The evening went on like this for a while. Roberto tried to join conversations, but people seemed uncomfortable around him. He bid on a few items in the silent auction, hoping to contribute something to Isabella's school. He bought raffle tickets and helped set up chairs when the principal asked for volunteers. But he could feel eyes on him, and he could see people whispering to each other when they thought he wasn't looking. About halfway through the evening, Roberto decided to get some fresh air. He walked out to the hallway where it was quieter and cooler. He was standing by the trophy case looking at all the awards and pictures from past years when he heard voices coming from around the corner. "Did you smell that man with the little girl in the yellow dress?" It was a woman's voice, high and sharp. "Oh yes, Mrs. Henderson," another voice replied. "He smells absolutely fishy. I could hardly stand next to him." Roberto's heart sank. Mrs. Henderson was the president of the Parent-Teacher Association. She was one of the most important parents at the school, and everyone seemed to respect her opinion. "I don't understand why some people don't take better care of themselves," Mrs. Henderson continued. "It's really quite inconsiderate to come to a school function smelling like that. Think of the children, especially Isabella," the other woman said. "That poor girl. She seems so sweet. But how embarrassing for her to have a father who can't even bother to clean himself up for a school event." Roberto felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes. These women were talking about him like he was some kind of problem that needed to be solved. They were talking about Isabella like she should be ashamed of him. He thought about leaving right then. He could make an excuse to Isabella, say he wasn't feeling well or that he had to work early the next morning. But then he remembered the excitement in his daughter's eyes when she had adjusted his collar. He remembered how proud she had been to introduce him to her friends. He couldn't disappoint her, no matter how much these comments hurt. Roberto took a deep breath and walked back into the gym. He found Isabella standing with a group of kids near the dessert table. She ran over to him with a big smile. "Papa, where did you go? I was looking for you everywhere." "Just getting some air, mija. Are you having a good time?" "The best time," Isabella said. "Mrs. Henderson said they're going to have some entertainment soon. There's supposed to be someone playing piano." As if she had heard her name, Mrs. Henderson walked up to the microphone at the front of the room. She was a tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive jewelry. Everything about her seemed designed to show that she was important and successful. "Good evening, everyone," Mrs. Henderson said into the microphone. "We're having such a wonderful turnout tonight. Before we announce the winners of our silent auction, we have a special treat. Local pianist David Martinez was going to perform for us tonight." The crowd applauded politely. Roberto noticed that Isabella's face lit up at the mention of live piano music. She had always loved music, probably because she grew up listening to him play at home. But then Mrs. Henderson's expression changed. She looked worried and a little panicked. "Unfortunately, I've just received word that Mr. Martinez has had a family emergency and won't be able to make it tonight. I'm afraid we don't have any musical entertainment after all." A disappointed murmur went through the crowd. Roberto saw Isabella's face fall. She had been looking forward to hearing live music, and now she looked crushed. Mrs. Henderson tried to keep things moving. "Well, no matter. We'll just move on to announcing our auction winners, and then we can all enjoy the rest of our evening." But the energy in the room had changed. People seemed disappointed and restless. Some families were already starting to pack up their things, ready to leave early. Roberto watched his daughter's disappointed face and felt something stirring in his chest. It was a mixture of anger and sadness and something else, something that felt like courage. Isabella looked up at him with those big dark eyes. "Papa," she whispered, "you could play piano for everyone. You're so much better than any pianist they could hire." Roberto's mouth went dry. The idea of standing up in front of all these people, the same people who had been talking about how he smelled, was terrifying. But looking at his daughter's hopeful face, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was time to show them who he really was. Roberto looked down at Isabella's hopeful face and felt his heart racing. Around them, people were starting to gather their coats and purses. The fundraiser was ending earlier than planned, and everyone seemed disappointed about the missing entertainment. He could hear parents making excuses to their children about why they had to leave. "Papa," Isabella whispered again, "you could help. You could make everyone happy." Roberto's hands were sweating. He wiped them on his pants and looked around the gym. Mrs. Henderson was still standing at the microphone, looking flustered as she tried to keep people from leaving. The principal, Mr. Garcia, was talking quietly with some of the other parents, probably trying to figure out how to save the evening. Mija, Roberto said softly. It's not that simple. These people, they don't know me. They might not want to hear me play. Isabella took his hand in both of hers. Her small fingers were warm and steady. Papa, remember what you always tell me? You say that music doesn't care what someone looks like or where they come from. You say music only cares if it comes from the heart. Roberto stared at his daughter. Those were his words, spoken during their quiet evenings at home when he taught her about the piano. He had told her that music was the one language that everyone could understand, no matter who they were.
Now she was using his own wisdom to challenge him. Mrs. Henderson's voice crackled through the microphone again.
Well, folks, I guess that's all for tonight. Thank you so much for coming out and supporting our school. Please drive safely on your way home. People started moving toward the exits more quickly now. Roberto watched families heading for the door, children dragging their feet because they didn't want the evening to end yet. He saw Isabella's classmates looking sad that their special night was being cut short. Then something happened that changed everything. Roberto heard a familiar voice calling out from across the room. Wait a minute, Mrs. Henderson. Everyone turned to look. It was old Mr. Chen, the grandfather of one of Isabella's classmates. He was walking slowly toward the front of the room, using his cane for support. Mr. Chen owned the Chinese restaurant 3 blocks down from the butcher shop. Roberto had seen him many times over the years, but they had never really talked. Mr. Chen, Mrs. Henderson said into the microphone. Is everything all right? Mr. Chen reached the front of the room and gestured for the microphone. Mrs. Henderson looked confused but handed it over. The old man's voice was quiet but clear as he spoke. Excuse me, everyone. I know you're all disappointed about the music tonight, but I think I might have a solution. He paused and looked around the room until his eyes found Roberto. There's someone here tonight who plays piano better than any professional I've ever heard. Roberto felt the blood drain from his face. How could Mr. Chen possibly know that he played piano? They had never talked about music. They barely knew each other at all. Mr. Chen continued speaking. My apartment is right above my restaurant. Every evening around 8 o'clock, I hear the most beautiful piano music coming from somewhere nearby. For months, I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Then one night, I saw him through his window. Roberto from the butcher shop playing piano like he was born to do it. The entire gym fell silent. Every eye in the room turned to look at Roberto. He felt like he was going to be sick. His secret was out, exposed in front of all these people who had already judged him and found him wanting. Roberto, Mr. Chen said gently, would you consider playing for us tonight? These children deserve to hear something beautiful. Roberto looked around the room. Some people looked surprised. Others looked skeptical. A few were whispering to each other, probably wondering if this was some kind of joke. Mrs. Henderson looked like she had swallowed something sour, but then Roberto saw Isabella. She was looking at him with such love and pride that it made his chest ache. Her eyes were shining with tears, but they were happy tears. She believed in him completely, just like she always had. Go ahead, Papa, she whispered. Show them. Roberto took a deep breath. His hands were shaking, but he stepped forward. I could try, he said, his voice barely loud enough to hear. Mr. Garcia, the principal, stepped forward with a smile. Roberto, that's wonderful. We do have a piano here. He gestured toward the corner of the gym where an old upright piano sat covered with a sheet. It's not in perfect condition, but it should work fine. Roberto walked toward the piano on unsteady legs. Every step felt like it took forever. He could hear people whispering behind him, and he tried not to think about what they might be saying. When he reached the piano, his hands were trembling so badly he wasn't sure he'd be able to play at all. He pulled the sheet off the piano and folded it carefully. The instrument was old and scratched, but it looked like it had been loved once. Roberto sat down on the bench and adjusted it to the right height. The keys were yellowed with age, and a few of them stuck a little when he pressed them gently. The room behind him had grown completely quiet. Roberto could feel hundreds of eyes watching him, waiting to see what would happen. He thought about all the evenings he had played alone in his apartment, pouring his heart into music that no one else ever heard. He thought about the comments he had overheard in the hallway. He thought about Isabella's faith in him. Roberto placed his hands on the keys and closed his eyes. For a moment, he forgot about the crowd behind him. He forgot about the whispers and the judgmental looks. He forgot about everything except the music that lived in his heart. He started with something simple and gentle. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same piece Isabella had mentioned wanting to learn. The first notes rang out clear and sweet in the quiet gym. Roberto's hands, the same hands that people avoided touching at the butcher shop, moved across the keys with grace and precision. As he played, Roberto felt something magical happening. The music was washing away all his fear and embarrassment. Each note seemed to tell the story of who he really was, not just what people thought they saw when they looked at him. The melody spoke of quiet evenings with his daughter, of dreams he had never shared, of beauty that existed in unexpected places. Behind him, the room remained absolutely silent. Not a single person moved or spoke. Even the smallest children seemed to understand that they were hearing something special. Roberto lost himself in the music, his fingers finding every note with the confidence that came from years of practice and a lifetime of love for the piano. When the last note faded away, Roberto sat still for a moment, afraid to turn around and see the reaction. The silence stretched on, and he began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. Maybe they had all left. Maybe they were disappointed. Maybe the old piano had sounded worse than he thought. Then he heard it. One person started clapping, then another, then the whole room erupted. 6 months later, Roberto stood backstage at the community center, adjusting his tie for the third time. His hands weren't shaking anymore like they had that first night at the school. Tonight felt different. Tonight he was ready. The sounds of people talking and finding their seats drifted through the curtain. Isabella peeked out from behind him and grinned. "Papa, there are so many people out there." "I think every seat is full," Roberto smiled at his daughter. She was wearing a new dress, deep blue with tiny silver stars on it. She had saved up her allowance money for weeks to buy it specially for tonight. "Are you nervous, mija?" "A little bit," Isabella admitted. "But mostly I'm excited. I can't believe we're really doing this together." Neither could Roberto, if he was being honest. So much had changed since that night at the school fundraiser. After his performance, everything in his life had shifted in ways he never could have imagined. The applause that night had gone on for almost 5 minutes. When Roberto finally turned around on the piano bench, he saw something he had never seen before. Every single person in that gym was on their feet, clapping with genuine enthusiasm. Children were jumping up and down. Parents were wiping tears from their eyes. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had complained so bitterly about his smell, was applauding with a look of complete amazement on her face. That night had been just the beginning. Word spread quickly through the small town about the butcher who could play piano like a concert artist. People started coming into the shop not just for meat, but to talk to him about music. Customers who had barely looked at him before began asking about his favorite composers and whether he gave lessons. Mrs. Patterson, the nurse who had been at the fundraiser, was the first to ask if he would consider teaching her daughter. Then Dr. Williams wanted to know if Roberto could play at his wife's birthday party. Before long, Roberto found himself with more requests than he could handle. But the most important change came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the fundraiser, a man in an expensive suit walked into the butcher shop. Roberto recognized him as one of the parents from that night, though they hadn't spoken. "You're Roberto, right? The pianist?" the man had said. "My name is Vincent Torres. I run the music program at the community college." Roberto had nodded, still not quite believing that people were seeking him out to talk about music. "I've been thinking about what I heard the other night," Vincent continued. "Have you ever considered performing professionally? Or maybe teaching music?" Roberto had laughed, not because it was funny, but because it seemed so impossible. "I work at a butcher shop," he had said. "I don't know anything about professional music." "You know more than you think," Vincent had replied. "Would you be interested in talking about some opportunities?" That conversation led to others. Vincent introduced Roberto to other musicians in the area. He helped him understand how the music world worked outside of his living room. Slowly, carefully, Roberto began to build a new life alongside his old one. He still worked at the butcher shop. He still took pride in cutting the perfect steak and selecting the freshest fish. But now he also taught piano lessons 3 evenings a week. He played at weddings and birthday parties on weekends. He had even performed with the community college orchestra twice. Tonight was different, though. Tonight was special because Isabella would be joining him on stage for the first time. Over the past few months, Roberto had been teaching his daughter more seriously. She had always shown talent, But now she was really learning to play with skill and confidence. When Vincent suggested that father and daughter perform together at the community center's monthly concert series, Isabella had been over the moon with excitement. "Places everyone," called the stage manager. 2 minutes to curtain. Roberto took Isabella's hand and squeezed it gently. "Remember what we practiced. Don't worry about making mistakes. Just play from your heart." Isabella nodded seriously. "Papa, can I tell you something?" "Of course, mija." "That night at school when you played for everyone? That was the proudest I've ever been to be your daughter. Not because you played so beautifully, but because you were brave enough to show everyone who you really are." Roberto felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Isabella, you are the reason I found that courage. Everything good in my life starts with you." The stage manager gave them their cue, and father and daughter walked out onto the stage together. The bright lights made it hard to see the audience at first, but Roberto could hear the warm applause welcoming them. As his eyes adjusted, he began to pick out familiar faces in the crowd. There was Mr. Chen, sitting in the front row with his granddaughter. Vincent Torres was there with his family. Dr. Williams and Mrs. Patterson had come, along with many other parents from Isabella's school. Even Mrs. Henderson was there, though she looked somewhat uncomfortable in the community center's simple folding chairs. But the biggest surprise was seeing Tony, his delivery truck driver, sitting near the back with his wife and teenage son. Next to them were several of Roberto's regular customers from the butcher shop. These were people who had watched him change over the past few months, who had seen him grow into this new version of himself, while still remaining the reliable, skilled butcher they had always known. Roberto sat down at the grand piano while Isabella arranged her music on the stand of the smaller keyboard beside him. They had practiced this moment dozens of times, but it still felt magical to be here together, sharing their music with so many people who cared about them. They started with a piece they had arranged together, a beautiful melody that allowed both piano and keyboard to shine. Isabella's part was challenging but not overwhelming, and Roberto's accompaniment supported her while adding layers of harmony that made the simple tune sound rich and complex. As they played, Roberto watched his daughter out of the corner of his eye. She was completely focused on the music, her small fingers moving confidently across the keys. Her face showed the same peaceful expression Roberto felt when he lost himself in playing. She had inherited more than just his musical ability. She had inherited his love for the art itself. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every note. When the first piece ended, the applause was enthusiastic but brief. Everyone seemed to understand that this was just the beginning. For their second number, Roberto played a solo piece while Isabella listened from her seat beside him. It was the same Chopin nocturne he had played that first night, but tonight it sounded different. Tonight it wasn't about proving anything or overcoming fear. Tonight it was simply about sharing something beautiful with people who wanted to hear it. When Roberto finished, Isabella stood up and walked to the microphone that had been set up for announcements. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she said, her young voice clear and confident. "I want to tell you something about my papa. He works very hard every day at the butcher shop to take care of me and to serve all of you. But at night, when we're at home, he makes the most beautiful music in the world. Tonight I get to make music with him, and that makes me the luckiest girl in the whole town." The applause that followed was unlike anything Roberto had ever heard. It wasn't just appreciation for the music. It was recognition of something deeper. These people weren't just clapping for a performance. They were celebrating the discovery of hidden beauty, the courage to share gifts that had been kept secret, and the love between a father and daughter who had found a way to make their dreams come true together. As they took their bows, Roberto realized that his life had become something he never could have imagined. He was still the same person who got up at 4:30 every morning to go to work. But now he was also someone who could stand on a stage and share his heart through music. The smell of the butcher shop still clung to his hands sometimes, but now when people noticed it, they also remembered the music those same hands could create, and that made all the difference in the world. The applause hit Roberto like a wave. He sat frozen at the old piano bench, unable to believe what he was hearing. The sound filled the entire gym, echoing off the walls and ceiling. It wasn't polite clapping like he had heard earlier in the evening. This was something completely different. This was real. Slowly, Roberto turned around on the bench to face the crowd. What he saw took his breath away. Every single person in that gym was standing up. Parents, teachers, children, even the janitor who had been quietly cleaning in the corner. They were all on their feet, clapping with enthusiasm he had never seen before. Mrs. Henderson, the same woman who had complained about his smell just an hour ago, was wiping tears from her eyes as she applauded. Dr. Williams was nodding his head with a look of complete amazement. The parents who had stepped away from him earlier were now moving closer to the piano, as if they wanted to be near the source of the beautiful music they had just heard. But the face that mattered most to Roberto was Isabella's. His daughter was clapping so hard her small hands must have been hurting. Her eyes were shining with pride and joy, and she was beaming at him like he had just given her the greatest gift in the world. In a way, maybe he had. The applause went on for what felt like forever. Roberto didn't know what to do with himself. He had never been the center of attention like this before. At work, people barely looked at him when they talked to him. Now hundreds of eyes were focused on him, and for the first time in his life, it wasn't because something was wrong. Finally, the clapping began to die down, but people remained standing. Mr. Garcia, the principal, walked over to the piano with a huge smile on his face. "Roberto," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "that was absolutely incredible. How long have you been playing?" Roberto's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Since I was 7 years old." 7 years old? Mrs. Henderson had approached the piano too, and her voice was full of disbelief. "You mean you've been playing like that for most of your life?" Roberto nodded, still not quite able to believe this was really happening. "My grandmother taught me. She had an old piano in her house, and she said music was the most important thing I could ever learn." More parents gathered around the piano. The same people who had avoided him earlier were now pressing close, eager to hear more about his story. Children were tugging on their parents' sleeves, asking if they could learn to play piano too. "Roberto," said a voice from the crowd. A man Roberto didn't recognize pushed through the group of parents. He was wearing an expensive suit and had the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was used to being important. "My name is Vincent Torres. I run the music program at the community college." Roberto felt his heart skip a beat. He had heard of Vincent Torres. Everyone in town had. He was famous for discovering talented musicians and helping them build careers. "I have to ask," Vincent continued, "have you ever considered performing professionally or teaching music? Because what I just heard was extraordinary." Roberto looked around at all the faces staring at him. A few hours ago, these same people would have crossed the street to avoid walking too close to him. Now they were hanging on every word of a conversation about his musical future. "I never thought about it," Roberto said honestly. "I work at the butcher shop. I don't know anything about the music business." Vincent smiled. "You know the most important thing. You know how to make people feel something when you play. Everything else can be learned." Mrs. Patterson, the nurse, stepped forward. "Roberto, would you consider giving piano lessons? My daughter has been wanting to learn, and after hearing you play tonight, I can't imagine wanting anyone else to teach her." "My son, too," Dr. Williams added quickly. "He's been taking lessons with a teacher across town, but honestly, I don't think she plays half as well as you do." More requests started coming from the crowd. People wanted to hire him to play at weddings, birthday parties, anniversary celebrations. They wanted to know if he would perform at the community center's monthly concert series. Someone asked if he would be interested in playing with the local church choir. Roberto felt overwhelmed by all the attention and offers. He looked over at Isabella, who was still standing nearby with that proud smile on her face. She gave him an encouraging nod as if to say that she believed he could do anything. "I don't know," Roberto said slowly. "I still have my job at the butcher shop. I need to work to support my daughter." "But you could do both," Vincent said eagerly. "Lots of musicians have day jobs. You could teach lessons in the evenings, play at events on weekends. The music world is more flexible than you might think." Old Mr. Chen, who had revealed Roberto's secret in the first place, made his way through the crowd with the help of his cane. When he reached the piano, he put a gentle hand on Roberto's shoulder. "Young man," Mr. Chen said in his quiet voice, "I have lived in this town for 60 years. I have heard a lot of music in my time, but I have never heard anything as beautiful as what you just played for us tonight." The crowd murmured agreement. Roberto could see heads nodding all around him. Mr. Chen continued, "You have a gift that shouldn't be kept hidden. Tonight you made everyone in this room feel something special. Don't you think you owe it to yourself and to the rest of us to share that gift more often?" Roberto looked around at all the expectant faces. These were people who just hours ago had judged him based on how he smelled or what kind of work he did. But music had changed everything. Music had shown them who he really was underneath all their assumptions. "I'm scared," Roberto admitted, his voice barely audible. "I've never done anything like this before." Isabella stepped forward and took his hand. "Papa, remember what you always tell me when I'm scared to try something new?" Roberto looked down at his wise daughter and smiled despite his nervousness. "That the only way to fail is not to try at all." "Exactly," Isabella said. "And you also tell me that when we have something beautiful to share with the world, it's selfish to keep it to ourselves." The crowd was quiet, waiting to see what Roberto would decide. He could feel the weight of this moment, understanding that whatever he said next would change his life completely. He thought about his grandmother, who had first put his small hands on piano keys and told him that music was magic. He thought about all the evenings he had played alone in his apartment, wishing someone could hear the melodies that lived in his heart. He thought about Isabella, who had always believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. Roberto stood up from the piano bench and looked around at all the faces watching him. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't see judgment or pity or discomfort. He saw acceptance, admiration, and hope. "Okay," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Let's see what happens." The applause that followed was even louder than before. But this time Roberto wasn't overwhelmed by it. This time he stood tall and let the sound wash over him like a warm wave of possibility. This was just the beginning of something amazing. As people finally began to leave the gym, they stopped by the piano to shake Roberto's hand and thank him. They exchanged phone numbers and made plans. Mrs. Henderson, looking genuinely embarrassed about her earlier behavior, asked if she could schedule a meeting to discuss having Roberto perform at future school events. "I was wrong about you," she said quietly. "I judged you unfairly and I'm sorry. Tonight you showed us all something beautiful." Roberto accepted her apology with grace. He was learning that holding on to anger would only weigh him down, and tonight was about moving forward, not looking back. Vincent Torres was the last to approach him. "Roberto, I meant what I said about opportunities. Here's my card. When you're ready, call me. I think you could have a real future in music if you want it." Roberto took the card and nodded. "Thank you. I will." As he and Isabella finally walked out to their car, Roberto felt like he was walking in a dream. The parking lot was mostly empty now, but a few people called out goodbyes and thanked him again for the music. Isabella climbed into the passenger seat and buckled her seatbelt. "Papa, tonight was the best night ever. Everyone finally got to see how amazing you are." Roberto started the car and smiled at his daughter. "Tonight was pretty special, wasn't it?" "What happens now?" Isabella asked. Roberto thought about Vincent's business card in his pocket, about all the requests for lessons and performances, about the possibility of a life he had never imagined could be his. "Now we see what tomorrow brings, mija. For the first time in a long time, I think it's going to bring some wonderful surprises."